Hi, I'm Jeanette Peterson, writer and mindfulness coach. Welcome to the Art of Mindful Disruption, where I share conversations to help relax, motivate, ponder, and inspire you to grow. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this mindfulness meander with me as I traverse some topics that might just make you think differently about pretty much everything in life. If you stick with me, over time, I will challenge your thinking and emotions in ways that you may never have considered possible. You see, mindful disruption is not about chasing solutions. It's about building awareness and allowing the solutions to find you. So before we start, let's take some long, deep breaths together to center our attention and to calm our nervous system so we can be fully present, because we know that this is the best place to begin. So let's feel into some long, slow, deep breaths. And I want you to breathe in nice and deeply through your nose. Feel those breaths as they go all the way down your nose, your throat, into your chest, and all the way down into your stomach, so you can feel your stomach rise. And we're going to continue to take a few of these breaths just to really center ourselves, become present. So keep breathing in, long, slow, deep breaths. Breathe them all the way in and feel them all the way deep into your body. If you're not driving a car or doing anything that allows you to, you're welcome to close your eyes to feel into these breaths. So if you have a nice, quiet, peaceful spot where you're listening to this today, really feel into those breaths, long and slow, breathing all the way in, feeling them, and breathing all the way out. Let's take a few more, breathing all the way in, through that nose, and slowly breathing all the way out. Now, when we calm our breath this way, it doesn't just draw our attention to the present moment, but it centers our body a little bit. So if things have been hectic before this, or you're in a rush to get somewhere, or you're feeling stressed or anxious in any way, those breaths will just help to center you. So you're ready for the topic that we're going to talk about this week. So today's topic is quite personal to me. It's one that is very close to me, and it was an experience that I first learned to understand through my own personal experience. So today we're going to talk about the art of full vision, uncovered through the eyes of a vision impairment. And this might sound quite strange. How could you possibly uncover full vision if you have an impairment? Well, I don't actually have a vision impairment myself, but I did have a mother who had a vision impairment for many, many years. And so for probably about at least 20 to 25 years, she lost what would be considered 75% of her vision. So she had some vision left. However, she actually lost the majority of her vision. So this is a difficult situation, obviously, for someone to go through in life. I mean, there are different types of vision impairments, but for my mother to lose her vision potentially in her 50s is quite an early age for someone to lose their vision. So she didn't particularly lose it through an aging condition. My mother actually had what is known as a pituitary adenoma. So she had a growth that was in her brain that was wrapped around her optic nerve. So my mother actually had perfect vision. Well, as close as perfect. She did wear glasses, but she could see clearly like all of us could with glasses on. And one day she noticed that she had spots in front of her eyes, and she thought that they were on her glasses, so she took her glasses off to clean them and discovered that they weren't on her glasses at all, so she quite promptly went off to see an optometrist who then sent her on to a specialist, and they quite quickly discovered that it was in fact that she had a brain tumour, and they were concerned that that tumour was wrapped around the optic nerve. Now, that tumour went on to be benign, so it didn't actually kill my mother, but I remember very clearly my mother said to me quite early on when she lost her vision, and she said, "There are worse things than dying." And this was a really strange moment for me when my mother shared that with me. It was because she'd always been a person who rose to the every occasion. She'd had car accidents in her life where it had caused her injuries, and she'd had a number of other things that had occurred, but she hadn't obviously lost her vision, and it was something that was obviously particularly important to her, as it is to most of us. But her vision actually disappeared literally overnight. So it was quite alarming how quickly these things can happen. Now, obviously in hindsight, it was determined later on that the tumour had obviously been growing for many, many years, that it was just growing at a slow rate. Now, if you don't know where your pituitary gland is, if you kind of look to your middle of your eyebrows and halfway back into your head, so right in the middle of your skull, I suppose you could say, in your brain is where your pituitary gland is. So it's in a particularly tricky place. Now, she had surgery and a number of times actually to maintain the little bit of vision that she had. But a really interesting thing happened living for a number of years. And in fact, I cared for my mother for the last 8 years of her life. And it's interesting how her vision impairment helped to uncover the fullness of my vision. Now, this is not something that seems particularly obvious straight away. You see, we all know that we have 5 senses, right? But do you know that the average person spends 80% of their time using only their eyes? So that's 80%. So what about all those other, the 4 senses that we specifically know about? There are lots of other senses that we're not so aware of as individuals, but I think there's over 30 that have been determined that we can actually feel into what they are once we become more aware of our bodies, and there's probably thousands more that we just haven't tapped into or science hasn't uncovered as yet. But why do the other 4 senses get such a raw deal? I mean, there is much for the eyes to see in the world. We live bombarded by constant and never-ending visual stimulus. But what if there is more than we actually see? You see, we might be using our eyes 80% of the time, but I don't think necessarily we're seeing everything that is out there and that is available to us. So I think let me share you a story how I uncovered this, and then we'll talk more about understanding what this potentially means, maybe for you or for anyone else in your life. So how did I learn so much about vision when caring for a mother who is visually impaired? My mother's life was obviously changed forever. She adjusted like she always had, but in a strange twist, her vision impairment taught me how to see the world in a magnificent way I had not fully understood before. When I told my mother this, that her vision impairment was actually teaching me how to see better, she laughed. My mother had a good sense of humour, and she managed to find ways to laugh at pretty much anything in life. I guess you could say we kind of learned to adapt together. So while she laughed and she learned to grasp the best part of what she could see And in the process, she refused to help the aid of a seeing eye dog because she didn't want to draw unnecessary attention to herself, and she thought, in the typical way my mother did, that there was somebody else who deserved or needed a seeing eye dog more than she did. And you see, the very first thing that I learned was to be my mother's very own seeing eye person. Now, we used to have a joke about this because I acted in all the ways that potentially a seeing eye dog would act. So we would be walking along and my mother would have her arm held into my arm, and as we walked, if there was a crowd ahead or if there was an obstacle, I would naturally just lean on her in a little bit and either pull her towards me or push her in another direction. And she became quietly in tune and aware to what I was doing. Now, at first, she was like, "Why are you pushing me?" And then we realised it was because I was simply surveying the ground ahead, when in the past, being fully with 20/20 vision, I never really looked at the ground very often, only with a casual glance, as most of us do. But I became the surveyor of the space ahead. And by doing this, I started to see things that I had not seen before. And so I was beginning to use my eyes in ways that I hadn't needed. And I realised something quite remarkable, that our eyes are very lazy pretty much all of the time. Only the minimum information we seem to need, we take in to get us through life. Whereas I began to have to take in a whole lot more information so I could support my mother in this way. So it was quite an interesting experience. And obviously, because mindfulness was quite a significant practice to me at this time, so when I began to act in this way, it just became a very natural thing to do. But I became very aware of how it was adjusting my actions and the vision that I was seeing. So it's interesting that once you apply mindfulness to things that you do in life, and I'm sure there'd be people that would listen to this that potentially have known people or supported people who have disabilities, or who potentially have impairments like vision impairments that mean that they need your support on some occasions, and even just elderly parents or grandparents that we need to support and help sometimes because they're not as steady on their feet as they used to be. But what was the most remarkable thing was that I learned to see the things that I'd simply taken for granted. I learned of the significance in the small and the awe in the huge. So I had to learn to look out for things that could be trip hazards that I knew that my mother wouldn't be able to see. And I learned to describe things in detail to my mother when she was unable to see the detail that was there. And it was quite a beautiful thing to be able to do. So I almost stepped in to fill the void of the vision that my mother had lost. Now, I didn't do this intentionally. I actually just did this very naturally. It was something that I didn't think about. I just seemingly did it on autopilot. And the more time that I spent with my mother looking after her, the more detail and the more comprehensive this became. And it did two things. Well, I did lots of things really, but it did a really great thing for my mother and I. It increased the quality of our relationship because I began to understand probably in more detail than I had in the past the things that she liked to see and the things that were important for her to be aware of. But it also gave her the ability to be confident in moving through spaces and places that she couldn't see because she knew that I was taking care of that and that she wouldn't have to be concerned. So in this process of applying mindfulness to the support I was providing my mother, something quite interesting happened. So I learnt about a process that is called memory vision. So when someone loses their vision later in life, even though they can't see things, they have a memory of what things look like. So obviously when you talk about things, they can still remember what it's like in their mind. And apparently it's quite powerful, because memory vision can actually feel like, when you've lost your vision, that you are seeing things that you can't actually see. So that's how powerful the mind is. But what was lovely was my mother was a big lover of watching sunsets, and we frequently chased many of them in many places. So when she sat and she felt the warmth of the sun on her skin, she could remember the beautiful sunsets she'd seen before. I would sit with her and I'd describe the scene before I was enabling her to memory see, because the words are incredibly powerful in the heart. Never underestimate the vision that your words can bring. And I learned this very, very clearly in the time that I spent with my mother, being her vision. So how, you might think, has this helped and supported me in life? Well, today and over many times, I've taught clients, sometimes through guided meditation, and many have remarked that my voice is powerful. This power was enhanced through my mother's vision impairment. In fact, I now understand, through everything that happens in life, there is a valuable lesson to be learned. And this is where I learned the lesson of full vision and understood the depth that full vision actually went to in many other spaces. So I would say to you all, open your eyes to see all you can see, not just all that you see right now. You see, the crumbs on the floor in the kitchen don't matter, neither do the fingerprints on the glass. But I had to learn that the hard way. When my mother first lost her vision, I was probably borderline, obsessive compulsive. I was a clean freak, and if I saw crumbs on the floor, I was cleaning them up. If I saw marks on windows or on the glass anywhere, I was always cleaning them. Now, when my mother became vision impaired, she couldn't actually see the crumbs, and she couldn't see the marks on the glass. And so at first I busily was cleaning them up because they were driving me mad. And my mother would be wiping the bench in the kitchen thinking she was being helpful to clean up, when in fact she was actually just wiping all the crumbs onto the floor. Now this was incredibly supportive to me, because obviously that need to be obsessively clean wasn't particularly healthy in my life. And so I learned that the crumbs didn't matter anymore. And I learnt that the marks on the glass were just not important. It's the other things in life that are so much more important. I learnt to see so many other things that I probably hadn't seen because I was busy looking at those things that didn't matter. And I learnt to see things and describe them incredibly well, like the dimples of a smile and the shadows that you cast are some of the many things, and which were much more inviting to describe. So it's interesting, because I was in a position where I was describing the way things appeared to somebody who couldn't see them, so she could become aware of them. And describing crumbs on the floor is pretty dull. So I think it really raised the bar for me to actually become more interesting about the things that I described. And so it enabled my mother to have a much more colourful life. Now, she had a background where she studied English literature and she was an avid reader. So my mother had an incredibly complex and beautiful sense of adventure and awareness and discovery and she could tell a story so beautifully. She read many books and stories that she would remark to me in parts of them while she was reading them, and she had such a beautiful way of describing it. So in some ways she was passing on that skill to me, because I had to become much more creative in describing the world around me. So in describing it, I was observing it more. So it's really quite incredible when you think that something, so significant as a loss for somebody else, how you would possibly think that it could be a gain for someone else at exactly the same time. Now, many people in my life, said to me, oh, it must be terribly hard, to look after your mother all the time. And I never actually felt like it was that way. It was an absolute pleasure for me to care for her. I mean, when you're a grown-up child, you know that as your parents grow older, that, someone's going to have to take care of them. And I guess that in the later years of her life, that happened to become me. But I never imagined how much I would learn from that process. Now, if I'd believed what people had said to me, I would have thought, oh, this is going to be such a drag, having to look after an elderly parent. But in fact, it wasn't at all. So if you're one of those people, just like me, that you take care of somebody, or you have an elderly parent, or you may even have a child or a partner that you care for that is vision impaired, think about how you could expand your ability to be more visually aware, to support and fill in the gap for them. Now, this didn't just obviously help my mother, this helped me in many ways. And I've really honed some techniques in mindfulness around this that are things that you could quite easily adopt for yourself. And they're not big things. They're things that are so simple. But when you start to become more aware, and awareness is obviously the key, but building awareness is incredibly enriching to your life. So think of a situation, maybe if you get on a train to go to work, there are places and images out that window of the train that you have never seen. Yet we get on the train and we think it's the same old trip every day. And I began to do things to really start to feel into what that was and start to understand. So I used to get on the train and go into the city to go to work, and I'd get on the train and I'd make an effort to look out the window and every day to see if I could find something I hadn't seen before. And at the time I was getting on the train going to the city 5 days a week, and every single day I saw something new that I'd never seen before. Now, prior to that, I had been getting on this train for months and months, in fact years, and I'd never noticed. And I started to think, well, if I didn't see what was out the window of the train, what else wasn't I seeing? So I became much more in tune with the awareness to pull more into the picture, not just to help my mother and support for her to have the most fulfilling life that I could ensure that she had, but to maximise that fulfilment in my life as well. So I became very good at what I call zooming in and zooming out. This is an interesting skill. So in life, we often need to do it in our jobs. If we're strategic in the way you operate, or particularly your role requires you to be, you are often a person who naturally zooms out. And I do this frequently because I work in strategic transformation, and I need to be able to observe the big picture for clients that I work with to help them find their way forward. So I'm naturally very strategic. But what I wasn't doing was I wasn't zooming in. So I was missing some of the detail. In fact, I can laugh about it now, but I remember very clearly when I was younger, I used to say to people, I'm a big picture thinker. I prefer to leave the detail for other people, because I was the third child, the creative one. But I could see the detail, but I just wasn't looking at it. And when I started to focus on it, I had an incredible capacity to really delve in and see some detail. And I was starting to walk in nature and I was seeing some beautiful detail that I was missing completely. And I did all kinds of things. Like I started photography, where I would take pictures of the ground close up, and then I would zoom into that picture. And I found some of the most amazing tiny things that were obscured from my view, that you just walk along the grass and you don't even notice them. So I became, acutely aware that there was more around me than I had realised previously. So maybe the next time, if you travel on public transport, or if you walk somewhere, whether you walk to work, or whether you walk from the train to work, or you walk to pick up your kids from school, or even if you're just walking in the park, take some time to be more aware. And instead of, while you're walking, thinking of something else, be present and be in the park and start to really focus in on that moment and look for the things that you haven't seen before. You might be surprised what will happen and how that can transform your life. So then when you're in a situation where, and this is a very common situation that I was able to then apply that skill I quite quickly developed, was that when I was sitting in a meeting, I could very quickly see the changes in people's facial expressions before they were significant. I could see the small changes in their mannerisms that made me realise when they were uncomfortable. So I was starting to become so much more aware of my surroundings through my eyes that these skills became incredibly beneficial. So wherever you're walking next time, try to place some close attention and see if you can see things you haven't seen before. And when you're travelling on public transport, look around and notice the expressions on people's faces. And when you make eye contact with someone, smile, because you never know, it just might make their day. Instead of avoiding the people that are there, really feel into what you can see in your surroundings. There are people that don't have vision anymore, and there are people who were never born with it. Take full advantage and enjoy it, and enjoy its limits and stretch the limits way beyond what you're aware of. They say that potentially, on average, that we see less than 20% of what is in front of us. So we're spending 80% of our time feeling the environment around us through our eyes, and yet we see less than 20% of what's there. And that's only on average. Some of us are less engaged than that. So smile at people, be in the moment with your eyes and feel into what that looks like. And you'll be very surprised how it changes. And then if you adapt and you learn to zoom, it means you'll be able to look at the small things and realise that there are tiny things, and that in the world we are large as individuals in the world of the small. But then when you look at the expanse, so when you look up into the night sky and you see the stars, well, then you can be reminded that you are also small in the scheme of the large. So we are both large and small at the same time. Now, this is an interesting concept to consider, because we often don't think of ourselves this way, but by moving in and out, it enables you to apply this to other parts of your life. And this can include things like understanding when you don't play a significant role in something, when somebody else needs to lead the space, and that you can sit back and play a small role, because in part of the universe you're small. But then there are times, like with my mother, when she couldn't see, I needed to expand and enlarge into the world so I could support her. And the ability to zoom is a skill that overlays into other parts of your life. It's not just about looking, it's about understanding what seeing really means. And then you can start to play with it mindfully and see how it could be utilised and support you in many other parts of your life. So these tips that I'm giving you are tips for improving your vision, and they won't only expand your experience in the world around you, but one day you might find that they will help you expand the experience for somebody else, whether that be short term or whether it be long term. But it's all about the ways that we support and help each other through life. Now, this skill, or these many skills that I gained through that time in caring for my mother and having to become more visually aware, it even helps me in the way I write to this very day, because I write now in a much more descriptive way than I potentially wrote before, because I was used to writing and using words that were much more colourful and able to describe and invoke the same feelings and responses that I'm able to have because I can see. And this is particularly helpful, obviously, when you're writing, because you're trying to create a scene or create an image of something or a perspective or a story that you're trying to tell. So next time that you think about your vision, step back. Smile at the next person that you see. Be in the moment and be prepared to zoom so you can be less sometimes when you need to be, and you can be more sometimes when you need to be as well. This is the polarity of life, and it's a beautiful thing to experience mindfully, the power of being able to see. I hope today that this meander may have drawn some attention to areas of your life that mindfulness may be able to help you improve. Start small. You never need to do these things all in one hit. I cared for my mother for 8 years, so I developed these skills gradually over time, and it's the exponential growth factor that occurs once you start with awareness, and then you see where that awareness takes you and you expand, and you can take it to other parts of your life. If you learn these skills, don't just take it to other parts of your life, but share them with others so others can learn skills to expand. Let's face it, we live in a pretty beautiful world, no matter where you live. We have incredible scenery, we have incredible people, we have sunsets and oceans and mountains and trees and flowers. We have amazing architecture. There are so many things to be seen and admired, from the tiny to the significant. So appreciate them all, because one day you might not have the opportunity to appreciate them. This is how you live mindfully. If you'd like to know more about how mindfulness can help your life, this mindfulness meander that you're listening to today is one of a series of many meanders, and you can subscribe to the channel that you're listening to right now, and you'll be able to hear more. If you're a reader, I write a blog which they're both of the same name, The Art of Mindful Disruption, and you can read it. If you like to use an application that I have a publication in called Medium, You can find me in there in the art of mindful disruption, and you can actually play the blogs. So if you're driving in your car and you don't want to read them, they have a playback function, so you can just press play and you can hear the base content of the blog. I hope you've enjoyed this mindfulness meander with me. It's a pleasure for me to bring my experience to you and anyone that it may help in the world. And I hope that it brings you value and reward, and that it will help enhance your life. Until the next time, I'm Jeanette Peterson, mindfulness writer and coach, and I hope you have the pleasure of enjoying everything that you see.